Thank you for joining us tonight for what I know will be a source of anecdotes and remarks around dinner tables for quite a while to come, and at, I don't know what, at coffee shop lines and various places where people gather to say, what have you been doing lately? I heard these two folks speak, so that is going to freshen everyone's conversation in Boulder to have come tonight. This is a special session of FrackingSENSE. Tomorrow we are back on our regular schedule. We have Pete Morton, retired from the Wilderness Society, who will be talking about wildlife impacts of oil and gas development, and also he will be putting forward an exciting proposal for a big picture on how to think about these issues. He will be, this is something I cannot wait to hear, he will be redefining responsible oil and gas development. So St. Paul on the road to Damascus here, ladies and gentlemen. We are really on our way here. So, but that the point is that that would be worth coming to as well as this evening. This event is made possible by a grant from the National Sustainability Research Network, National Science Foundation Sustainability Research Network, for a project on hydraulic fracturing and natural gas development. And I also need to note at this point that the National Science Foundation does not endorse and is not burdened with responsibility for anything said in this series or by me, Patty Limerick, Director of the Center of the American West. We are grateful as well to our co-sponsor for the FrackingSENSE series, the Boulder County government. As usual, it is our priority to make sure that everyone who came to hear the speakers does hear the speakers. And so now the usual FrackingSENSE request. If you disagree with something a speaker says, you may note your difference of opinion by sighing with exasperation, snorting with skepticism, or even hissing with bitter disapproval. But you must stay within the boundaries of respiratory protest so that you do not disrupt your neighbor's ability to hear the speaker. This has not become a national movement yet. I don't know why. I mean, anybody who wants to get Congress on board with this, maybe that might be a thing. So, and we will stick with our drill of having you write your questions on the little sheets in the program. Folks from the Center of the American West, within about 15 or 20 minutes, will start walking around, collecting your questions, and also distributing more little sheets of paper if you need them. As to why we stick with this drill, I am still intoxicated with the fact that we can get our speakers to respond to a vast number of questions from the audience, in contrast to the limited number of questions we can cover if we go for spoken and sometimes kind of oratorical questions from the audience. So that will be our format. Also, I think once I did try to release people from this restraint, and all the FrackingSENSE regulars are so used to it that they wrote their questions and instantly forgot their questions, so that when I said you may now ask your questions, they said you will have to read them because we cannot remember what we said. So this is now a very hardwired custom for us.
Maybe they couldn't read their writing.
Some of their writing is lamentable, I'll say that. The handwriting is pretty bad. And these folks know that if you want to, you can write, if you are feeling ill-tempered, you can write an ill-tempered question and I will deliver it in a scornful and contemptuous voice, but it will just be a temporary performance. That actually does seem necessary and honest if you do write a question that has feeling in it, that I should convey that. Okay. Our distinguished speakers tonight are Timothy Wirth and Jim Martin. Tim Wirth is the Vice Chairman of the Board of the United Nations, my little parochial moment there, the United Nations Foundation and the Better World Fund. He was the UN Foundation's president from its founding in 1997 until 2013. He was our congressman from 1975 to 1987, and he became our senator in 1987. Jim Martin is senior counsel at the law firm Beatty and Wozniak. He has served as the regional administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency's Region 8, as the executive director of the Colorado Department of Natural Resources, as the executive director of the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and in both those two roles he served on the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, which I understand is one of the more festive and lively forms of public service.
Festive now.
And before holding those offices, he worked for Congressman and then Senator Wirth for 7 years. He impressed me with his wisdom from my first encounter with him. It's true. I don't know if you remember the story, but I was trying to sucker Senator Wirth into standing up for the Smithsonian that they'd had a rather controversial exhibit on Western American art. And there was no need on the planet for you to take on that trouble. to intervene and try to defend the Smithsonian. Well, Senator Stevens and Senator Gorton were on a campaign, and it was to cut the Smithsonian's funding. Anyway, I tried to sucker you into taking a stand on that. You did not need that trouble. I wrote a draft of a letter you might consider, and he killed that letter really fast, which I feel was the right move. So I didn't feel it at the time, but I feel it now. So I've been experiencing.
And neither Stevens nor Gorton got reelected.
Because you probably had some other ways of expressing your thoughts on that. So that's good. That's good. Okay, so our topic tonight is thinking about fracking and other mysteries, and I have a number of questions that I will be asking of the participants or my fellow panelists, and then at some point when we have enough questions, Adrian Krebs, by the way, we're always talking about the importance of the future and posterity and so on when we're talking about natural resource issues, and so it is a great thing that Adrian Krebs, who is notably young, is a member of our team on this National Science Foundation project. So she will be sorting the questions and preparing them with a youthful freshness, so she does that. So we are going to begin with question number 1, which is, what in your life has led you to appear tonight on a panel called Thinking About Fracking and Other Mysteries? So, Senator Wirth.
Well, thank you, Patty. And it's always wonderful to be on a panel with Jim Martin. I had the good fortune of holding a hearing once in the Capitol on transportation of hazardous materials. One of the more boring topics that there is. But we had witnesses all afternoon long, and the last witness that day was Jim Martin. And I stayed until the bitter end since I was chairing the hearing, and Jim Martin was testifying, and I thought, oh my Lord, I'm going to hire that guy, which I succeeded then in doing, and happily Jim came and worked for me for many, many years to my great benefit. So Jim, thank you from all of us this is the most extraordinary staff person and public servant in this whole area in the region, I think. So we're lucky to be here with Jim. And Patty, as ever, it's always fun to be with you. Patty, my wife Ren, and I went and took Western two-step lessons with Patty. How's your two-step, by the way? Is it good?
It's not what it should be, but we could do it. If an audience member were to ask for that in the question, they could try it.
Sounds like a political move, isn't it? A two-step. Fracking. Let me start with what I think is the most obvious, and that is that energy is climate, and climate's energy. You start thinking about the world around us by thinking about climate change and where does all of this come from? It comes from energy, so the more you can do to try to understand energy, the more you can begin to come to grips with truly the existential issue of our time, which is climate change. I mean, how are we going to deal with this? Where do we go from here? And, it is also the most fascinating issue that there is. I got engaged in this in about my second term in the Congress, sometime in the mid-1970s. Big, tall guy named Rafe Pomeranz, who later went to work for us in the State Department negotiating in the climate area, loped into my office, and that's the right verb, kind of loped into my office, and sat down and gangled over a chair and began to tell me about this new research that was out on climate change. And I had never heard of that before in my life. And so we began to explore it, look to see what was happening. Concurrently, I was deeply engaged in the science committee of having hearings on nuclear winter. And we had this remarkable hearing with Carl Sagan testifying in front of the House Science Committee. And I was chairing that hearing, and in the second row, my wife Ren was sitting next to this curly-haired guy who kept correcting Sagan under his breath, saying, "Oh, that's not right, that's not right, that's right." And that was Steve Schneider. Many of you may remember Steve Schneider, one of the great climate scientists who moved from Boulder to Stanford, and Steve became our tutor on the subject of climate change. We were very, very lucky to sort of have Boulder right in our backyard and to be able to deal with, the best science capability in the world to bring us up to speed, bring me up to speed, and begin to think about this. I carried this interest with me to the United States Senate, and in 1988, we held the first big hearing on climate change in the Senate Energy Committee. Jim Hansen, which many of you have heard about Jim Hansen. Jim Hansen gave his famous testimony that morning in which he said, yes, man's impact on the climate can be seen, can be felt, can be measured. It was a real blockbuster of a statement. It's a hearing that is still, resonates, I think, in lots of different places. Jim was, I think, running our Colorado office at that point.
No, I was still in D.C.
You were still in D.C.? Well, you remember that hearing very well.
It was hot as blazes.
We were accused of opening all the windows in the hearing room. It was on the 6th of June, which I think was the 6th of June, by record, the hottest day of the year. All the windows were open. I think some mischievous staff people had done that so that when we had this hearing on climate change, it was incredibly hot in the room. And we had all of this tremendous attention, and we moved from there to introducing a major piece of legislation on climate change. I think probably the most comprehensive bill ever done, ranging all the way from thinking about energy to thinking about population. There were, I think, 16 titles in the bill. It was not something we thought would pass, but rather, how do you think about this? How do you think about an issue that's this big? When I got to the State Department in 1993, the portfolio that I had included the environment area, and that included beginning to think about climate change and climate change negotiations. The Rio Treaty was behind us. 1992 was the Framework Convention on Climate Change in Rio, the major accomplishment of the Rio Environment Conference. And the job of the State Department then was to try to put some meat on the bones of really a negotiating instrument. I stayed in the State Department into Kyoto, which was the first major implementation document for the climate treaty, and then moved to with Ted Turner when he started the UN Foundation. And for 15 years we have had climate at the top of our agenda, attempting to strengthen and help the UN think about climate change. Now, into all of that at all times, of course, come various aspects of energy. And when at the UN Foundation, and I'll stop with this, at the UN Foundation, we started a group called the Energy Future Coalition. Right after 9/11, three of us got together, Boyd and Gray, who'd been counselor to the first President Bush, John Podesta, who's just gone back to the White House, and I started this group called the Energy Future Coalition in the belief that the roots of 9/11 were deeply in the energy world, and that if we could begin to get a true bipartisan coalition of people thinking about solutions to various energy problems in a different kind of a fashion, that was a contribution that we could make in those very dark and difficult and confusing post 9/11 days. So we started the Energy Future Coalition. About 6 years ago, we would have monthly meetings. They were very, very interesting gatherings. About 6 years ago, I began to hear from friends of mine in the natural gas community in Colorado about fracking and natural gas and this very new technology. So we had the first big discussion in Washington. Nobody had ever heard of this before. Sort of like climate change, nobody had ever heard of that. And then having this session on fracking, I can remember Dan Yergin was in the room, the great energy scholar, had never heard of fracking before. John Deutsch, who was the sort of Mr. Energy at MIT, had never heard of fracking before. They came in and they were, it was an extraordinary change. And it has been an extraordinary change. We can go into that, but the impact of the sudden abundance, or the apparent sudden abundance, of natural gas has changed so many different ways of thinking about, going back to where I started, thinking about climate as energy, energy as climate. So when Patty asked me if I would come this evening, I was delighted to do so, to hear from Jim Martin and hear all of your questions. And I know Patty's been running this great series, so I learned something about fracking as well. So that's a long journey from for about 30 years of discussions of energy and climate, and getting us right into this day and age in fracking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh. Does that work? Can you hear me? Oh dear. I can hear myself. Well, it's a delight to be here this evening and to talk about one of my favorite subjects, hydraulic fracturing oil and gas, and challenges that we face in managing the development of oil and gas in an environmentally and socially responsible way. I have to start by saying that everything I know about politics and government I learned from Tim Wirth. And I can actually encapsulate it in 3 different phrases. One is that you can't fight something with nothing. And another one is that you're always going to need 50% plus 1 to be successful. And the third is you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So I'll use an example from Colorado. The state of Colorado has been working at trying to figure out the perfect balance between environmental protection and development of a mineral resource for a long time, but certainly intensively over the last 10 or so years. In 2008, 2009, under Governor Ritter's leadership, we fundamentally changed the Oil and Gas Commission. It's no longer dominated by people with a direct connection to the oil and gas industry, but instead there's a majority of citizens with the responsibility for trying to implement what is admittedly a complex and challenging statutory mandate. We've established a whole new way of thinking about these things. We gave surface landowners, surface users, much more influence over the way in which resource development might occur on their land if they own only the surface estate as opposed to the place in fee simple. Colorado was the first state to require green completions or reduced emissions completions for both oil and gas virtually everywhere in the state. The Environmental Protection Agency followed some years later with the requirement for green completions or reduced emissions completions, but only for natural gas wells. They still haven't done oil wells. Colorado was the first state, I believe, to require disclosure of the chemicals that are used in hydraulic fracturing or well stimulation. And Colorado is now at a point where if an oil and gas company misstates the GIS coordinates on the form it submits to the frac focus, what is it, frac focus? Yes, frac focus. It can automatically lead to a $15,000 fine, penalty rather. It has become routine. Colorado is one of the first states, if not the first, to require comprehensive groundwater testing before and after a well is developed. And we will soon have tremendous amounts of data about groundwater quality across the state where oil and gas is either proposed or is occurring. But most recently, Colorado is the first state, way ahead of any other state and ahead of the Environmental Protection Agency in regulating emissions of methane from the oil and gas sector. It was a long and bruising battle before their Quality Control Commission, but just 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks and a day, the Commission adopted those regulations. They also adopted regulations requiring the most stringent leak detection and leak repair regulations in the country, well ahead of anything that the Environmental Protection Agency or any other state requires. For a large facility, they will be using one of those fancy IR cameras once a month for each facility, for every component at every facility, and then they'll be required to repair those leaks within 5 days unless there's some greater exigency involved. Colorado has significantly lowered the threshold for reporting spills of materials at an oil and gas site down to the point where virtually any spill gets reported and gets a response and an inspection. Colorado has significantly increased the resources devoted to inspections at both the Oil and Gas Commission and at the Department of Public Health and Environment. So Colorado has made huge strides in trying to find that balance between protection of the environment and development of a resource, which is found in a number of different parts of the state of Colorado. Having said that, I think you get back to the need, what is our goal? And I think that the goal is decarbonization of our economy over a period of years in a way that gets you 50% plus 1 or ideally more of the voters to support what you're doing, and in the process doesn't make you the enemy of the perfect in the search of the good. So what does that mean by that? I think that it's important to remember that oil and gas, the petroleum industry, whatever you want to call it, has a pervasive influence in our economy and in our society. So if you want to decarbonize our country, which is, I think, the goal many of us share, if not all of us share, then you have to think about how you're going to do that without alienating 50 or 60 or 70% of those voters. What does your plan look like, and how do you get there in a way that gets you support from the people in this country? And if you think about it, there are 254 million registered vehicles in this country, and 98+% of them run on some sort of petroleum product today. So if you're like me and you somehow ended up working in Denver, you never thought about it, never conceived of it, but every morning you get up at 5 o'clock, you drive to Denver from Longmont with all of those other people driving to work, going to take their kids to school, going to the grocery store, whatever else they're doing. You're one of them. In fact, to quote Pogo, we've met the enemy and the enemy is us. In 2012, just a year or 2 years ago, we consumed 366 million gallons of gasoline a day, every single day. Well, not counting Christmas Day. But otherwise, 366 million gallons a day. That's a task for decarbonization. In 2009, and the number has probably increased since then, about half of all residences were heated with natural gas. And there is, at the moment, no thought about what an alternative to heating with natural gas might be unless it's propane. We all learned a lesson about heating with propane this winter. Another 5 million commercial properties are heated with natural gas. Over the course of the next 2014 to 40, whatever number of years that is, we'll count on the mathematicians to tell us, the Energy Information Agency expects us to replace about 103 gigawatts of existing electric generation capacity, the vast majority of it coal. So if you don't do electrical energy issues, 103 gigawatts is one heck of a lot of gigawatts. That's a lot of energy. That's a lot of power plants. Most power plants are in the 400 to 700 megawatt range. So we're going to replace those. The good news, and there is good news out there, is that about 31% of the replacement of that capacity is going to be renewables, which 10 years ago, 15 years ago would have been unimaginable. So it's clearly good news, and it's important to remember that there's good news out there. But the other 63% at the moment is projected to be natural gas. At the moment, nuclear is not competitive, and coal doesn't seem to be competitive either, given the requirements for reducing carbon emissions in the atmosphere. So we're left with natural gas. Again, a challenge in decarbonization, also a challenge just in terms of managing how we produce all of those things. Along with that, if you're the president sitting in the Oval Office, and I've never been there, and I certainly will never be president, but if you think about the things that the president has to think about, is all of those things, what's the effect on the economy of decarbonizing our society and how we do it. But you also have to think about the fact that last year, the domestic production of oil and gas reduced our trade deficit by $63 billion. That's, we're no longer talking peanuts. The circuit of natural gas in this country, cheap natural gas, is leading to the investment of $100 billion in new manufacturing plants in this country, with all the jobs and all the paychecks that will come with $100 billion of investments in this country. The domestic production of oil and gas has given the President and the National Security Council vastly greater latitude in managing conflicts in difficult parts of the world than they had just 10 years ago. If you're sitting there in the Oval Office, you have to think about what that plan is, or if you want to influence the President, you have to think about what's your plan, how you're going to get 50% plus one, and you have to make sure that you're not making the perfect the enemy of the good. I think part of our goal tonight is to figure out how you get, what that plan looks like, and how you get to decarbonization of our society without managing to alienate more than 50% of the population because you've disrupted our society in such a profound way. And I think I've talked more than I should have.
Oh, I don't think so. I think that was very interesting and illuminating. I just will hand it over to you, but I am so taken with the promise of Christmas Day. I just think we need Christmas every day. Every day, or every week at least. So there's a policy
I know someone
approach.
who think that'd be a great idea.
I think anyone under 5 or under 10 would be
I
really
know someone
on board
under
with that.
50.
Oh, well, there you are. Okay, so that's our first concrete policy recommendation is more
You know,
Christmases.
Jim, I was driving my 3 grandsons into Denver from being up in the mountains on Sunday afternoon. And looking out across the plains, it was almost clear. No, I mean, it's very interesting. And 30 years ago, even on Sunday afternoon, we would have been driving into a dark cloud. I mean, that is, I was pointing out to them, I said, you know, this is so different and from what I remember when, a long time ago, and explaining what the brown cloud was and where that comes from and how to think about it. And that's a promising development, something that transpired that has been, you know, really positive for all of us. But let me just make four quick additions to Jim. Jim brings us up to speed on what has happened here, and I would say a large part, he was the quarterback for many, many of these activities that have occurred in the state of Colorado. Four kind of context for all of this. One is the science. You know, we know more about the science of climate change all the time. There is a major international scientific gathering called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is 2,000 to 3,000 of the best climate scientists in the world who come together every 6 or 7 years and produce a first-class study, number of volumes, on what's happening in the climate, what's the impact of that, and what we might do about it. And their most recent assessment is in the process of coming out right now. A lot of the scholars from NOAA and NCAR and the University of Colorado are members of the IPCC. The news is not good. We know about the intensity of the concentrations of carbon in the atmosphere. We know with certainty, up to the same certainty of smoking and health, that man is responsible and that the impact of climate change could be seen with that certainty. We all know about smoking and health, and the public certainly. I don't think there are very many people who would believe that smoking doesn't harm you. I think that same certainty now is the impact of man on the climate through the burning of fossil fuels. So the IPC is there, and there's this framework of science which is really extraordinarily good, and we're very lucky to have it, but it also frames the challenge for us. Related to that is what is said, what do we have to do? And that is to try to hold the temperature of the world, if you take it from the state level to what we have to think about internationally as a global community, to hold the increase in temperature in the world to 2 degrees centigrade, or about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. As much carbon goes into the atmosphere, we're using the atmosphere as a garbage dump. Lots of climates already up there. We're putting, you know, about 6,000 million tons a year of carbon in the atmosphere. No cost of that whatsoever. It's the world's freest, biggest garbage dump. We're putting this carbon up there. That is increasing the temperature of the atmosphere slowly but surely. We've gone up a little less than 1 degree, and we're on track to certainly go right, not only to, the consensus is that we can't go beyond 2 degrees without doing immeasurable harm to species on the face of the earth. Quick summary. We're halfway there. We're approximately halfway there with all of the carbon we've put up in the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So 2 degrees centigrade, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit is one goal, 450 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. The historic base was about 280 parts per million. We're above 400, or right about 400 now. We're going to blow past 450 very, very quickly, and we're going to find ourselves into real trouble. So, but the global community has come together, and general consensus of 2 degrees, 450 parts per million. That sets a target, and a very ambitious one. So what's the target mean to us? It means that we in the United States are going to have to reduce our emissions of carbon by about 80% by the year 2050. We have to reduce our emissions of carbon by about 80% by the year 2050. Jim laid out some of the parameters of that in thinking about how much do we drive? Well, what do we do about auto efficiency? What are alternative fuel? I mean, this leads you right into a path of what you do about this. You know, keeping our concentrations down and cutting our concentrations of carbon, our emissions in the United States. What do we do about power plants? What do we do about home heating? What do we do about agriculture? All of these pieces contribute to that goal, and the president has to think about each one of those, and each one of those is surrounded by a very, very large, powerful, well-funded lobby group. So he's got these enormous pressures on him. He is fully aware of the fact and very, very articulate about an 80% reduction and about 2 degrees and about 450 parts per million. I mean, he is as articulate about that as Al Gore is. He knows this stuff really well. He also knows who's hammering on his door day in and day out. A third point I think that's important for us to keep in mind in all of this, and Jim mentioned some of this, is how rapidly the whole energy picture in the United States has changed. It is completely different now from what it was, say, when I was first elected to the Senate from Boulder, from the state of Colorado, say, 25 years ago. You know, we now are, and all of the positive signs that exist in terms of energy policy, our production of oil, our decline in terms of coal-fired power plants, the efficiency of automobiles. I mean, one indicator after another. Our international posture, our ability to operate without great fear of the importation of energy anymore. We are completely different. So when he thinks about those constituencies walking into his office, the president also has a freer hand than he had before. And that is a huge change and a very positive one. We have not yet figured out, I think, how to deal with it. A final point, which is fascinating, is an issue called stranded assets. This may sound obscure, but it's not. Stranded assets means assets in the ground that we cannot use. If we say that we have used up about half of the amount of carbon that we can put into the atmosphere before we get to the 2-degree threshold. You remember I was back there? We've gotten about halfway there. We've got about halfway more to go. The amount of carbon that we've burned is, say, X. The amount of carbon, therefore, that we can still burn before we get to that 2-degree threshold is also X. So there's a total of 2X that we can burn and put into the atmosphere before we have to stop. But the amount of carbon that has been discovered by the oil and gas and coal community is approximately 5X. So there is a vast resource that's out there in the ground and largely valued by these very large, powerful, and important companies. Their balance sheets record the fact that they have this asset, and they're saying to Wall Street and saying to the world, value our stock at this level because we have this amount of asset in the ground for the future. They don't talk about the amount related to climate change, the concentrations in the atmosphere. They talk about how much carbon they have over how many years, how many, you'll read that, how many scores of years or how many hundreds of years of energy do we have. And that's how this carbon is normally reported. But internally within the industry, they are very aware of the fact that if controls are put on carbon, as have to be done to decarbonize our society and to save civilization, essentially, we have to put a cap on, which is going to strand a vast amount of resource, strand a lot of capital, strand a lot of wealth. And we have, so far, in my view, we have no idea how we're going to do that. And that is not just ExxonMobil. I mean, that's the Saudis, that's the United Arab Republic, that's the Venezuelans, that's every sovereign nation around the world with great resources of their own in the ground. They're going to bump up against the same 2-degree ceiling. And how does their carbon get valued, and how do we handle this stranded asset situation? It is exceedingly difficult and very, very political and big-time economics, obviously, engaged in it. We're just starting to think about that. So those are 4 other elements to make this even more complicated, Pat, and more interesting. Right?
Yes, that's good. Complication. We're all about complication at the Center of the American West. The complicated Center
Do
of
you
the
have a
American
question?
West. I do have a question. And my question is, I think I'm going to go with this one, of reflections from both of you on carbon reduction and natural gas, and where natural gas fits in that. I'm obviously asking about the bridge to the renewables and the concerns by a number of very active and audible groups that's perpetuating the problem rather than solving the problem, to keep burning a fossil fuel. And as you reflect on where natural gas fits in the decarbonization picture, that bridge question, and really what's the timetable that reasonable people could consider for that transition? So I did have a question.
Good.
And
It's a very good question.
Oh, thank
as
you. I
well.
appreciate that. Thank you.
Would you mind repeating it?
You should have sent that letter. Where does natural gas fit in the decarbonization scenario that you folks have been talking about? And what is this transition to renewables, and where is natural gas in that transition?
That's right.
Well, I think if you look into the near past, you can see one of the roles of natural gas, clean air, clean jobs, and 2000, probably people out there remember precisely what year that was, 2005, more recent, not quite that recent. But what clean air, clean jobs meant was that we got several oil and gas companies, mostly natural gas companies, and several conservation groups to agree on a strategy for, and Excel, by the way, the owner of some of these stranded assets that Tim was talking about, but we agreed on a strategy for cleaning up the air in Colorado, and especially in the Front Range, where a number of old, dirty coal-fired power plants are located, but where if you follow the typical approach for utility planning and for the Public Utility Commission's review of those things, you would end up with a very different result than where we ended up. You would probably, one at a time, address the mercury and then ozone and then particulate matter, and each time you'd attach a new piece of equipment to reduce emissions of that one pollutant, but ultimately spend way too much money on a bunch of very old, dirty coal-fired power plants. And our alternative, which is probably 90% of the way to being implemented, was to think about all of these things very differently, to think about them all together and what those costs are, and whether or not it didn't make sense to just retire a number of old coal-fired power plants and to clean up a couple of others, and to replace some of that capacity with natural gas, because the demand for that commodity, electricity, wasn't going away. It was being reduced by investments the state was making in energy efficiency, and it was being offset by investments the state was making in renewable energy, but there was still going to be significant demand for electricity that you had to replace in some way, and that was natural gas. As I said, the state and the utilities and others are about 90% of the way to implementing clean air, clean jobs, and what that means is that if you combine all of those emission reductions, we're going to reduce SO2 emissions from all of those coal-fired power plants by 83%, which will directly and immediately translate into reduced health effects for people, and especially people, the vulnerable populations in our society, the elderly, children, and people, adults with asthma, people with heart conditions, and so on. We'll reduce nitrogen oxides, one of the two contributors to the formation of ozone, by 86%, mercury by 82%, and here's the clincher, carbon dioxide by 28%. Well ahead of what any other state, perhaps with the exception of California, has actually achieved on the ground in thinking about how you plan for reducing emissions of everything from those conventional air pollutants to one of the principal greenhouse gases. And natural gas was an integral part of that. And I think natural gas can continue to play that role as we move from here to 2040, as we see an increasing number of coal-fired power plants, principally old, dirty coal-fired power plants where investments in emission controls make no economic sense. We'll continue to see replacement, as I said, of about 60% of that capacity with natural gas. So 50% of the carbon profile of a coal plant, and about 36%, maybe more, of that capacity replaced by renewables. I think that's a very significant part of a path forward, of a plan that doesn't impose upon ratepayers, upon consumers, significantly greater costs. You can do this actually at lower costs than what the alternatives might be. You replace some capacity with natural gas. New York City, under the leadership of Mayor Bloomberg, took much the same path. if you visited New York City 10 or 20 years ago, you wouldn't recognize the air quality if you went back to visit there today. They're dramatically reducing air pollution. In fact, the air quality in New York City today is better than it's been for 50 years, and that's because they're replacing old, dirty boilers that burn the dirtiest oil, the oil that produces the most particulates, the most pollutant in the atmosphere, with, among other things, natural gas, some other cleaner burning oils and biodiesels and a couple of other sources of energy, but principally natural gas. So you're reducing the carbon footprint, again, by 50%, and you're reducing emissions of those other pollutants by somewhere around 80 to 90% or more in the case of SO2 and mercury. So there is a path forward, and it didn't upset our society. We're still continuing to heat homes, we're still lighting homes, we're still lighting the skyscrapers. No one's probably even noticed this change, and Mayor made it almost painless in that transition. I think there's a path forward, and you have a plan, you can get 50% plus one, and you didn't make the perfect the enemy of the good.
Do you,
Well, I agree with everything that Jim said. And there's a little bit in all of this. It sounds good if you say it fast enough. And let me expand on that. Go back to imagine yourself as the President of the United States, and you're sitting in his office, or he's sitting there, and who are the constituents? Who are the people coming in and appealing to him? You know, one's going to be the AFL-CIO, very powerful voice for the future of the Democratic Party and major support. And Richard Trumka, who is now head of the AFL-CIO, is a quite remarkably wonderful man from southern Pennsylvania, who was the head of the United Mine Workers. And Trumka will come in and remind the president that in this transition away from coal, and you know how many there have been attacks on the president for being anti-coal and all of that sort of thing, but Trumka quite reasonably comes in and says to the president, there's a lot more at stake here than the 12,000 jobs that the environmental community blithely talk about. There are more to this industry than 12,000 coal miners. There is a whole train of people who are dependent upon coal. You go to Delta, Colorado, and Delta, Colorado is in major fashion dependent upon a coal industry that goes up the valley to some mines that are up into Gunnison County. The president has to think about, you know, how is he going to deal, and he's made the right decisions, by the way, but there is this hovering out there of the great pressure of the coal industry and the history of coal that has got its heels dug in to the transition to natural gas. Among other things, they will say, well, that's quite fine, Mr. Martin, to say that the emissions are cut very significantly, and we're at 28% better emissions. For carbon. Well, we got to cut our emissions by 80%. How are you going to get from here to there? This is a dream that you have, and they will attack this, not too vigorously, but in fact, that's what's going on, that this is really something of a snare and a delusion, and they might come in with the environmental community, and the environmental community will be quoting Achim Steiner, who is the head of the United Nations Environment Program, who asked the other day, is development of shale gas delaying the critical energy transition from fossil fuels to renewables? That by allowing ourselves to go down this natural gas track, we're really delaying the transition that has to be made. In fact, I would agree with Jim. It's the perfect in the way to the, being the enemy of the good. What is it? The other way around.
Enemy of the good.
But anyway, it's we have to make this. It's a transition fuel that is very important. We have to remember that it's a very important transition, but it comes with other costs as well. That it's natural gas that is in many cases, not partnering as I would hope, and I think Jim would hope, that the natural gas community would end up really partnering very aggressively and putting its political muscle behind the renewables community. so that as we are trying to move more aggressively and more rapidly as we have to renewables, it's natural gas that's out there making the argument, yes, we'll move to renewables and we'll be available when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow and so on. We'll be there as the backup fuel. Let's get together and make a very aggressive pact to move us from here to there. That would be my hope, that would happen. I think the President has tried to say that, but there are a lot of constraints along the way. I mean, I'm a major supporter of, the benefits that we've gotten from fracking and what that's done for us in so many different ways. But we have to remember also that it's part of a transition that is going to be for us a very, very hard one.
I want to take your statement there that you're a major supporter of fracking and what it's done for us, and I want us to go to local concerns about that. When you mentioned the reduction of the trade deficit, well, that's very striking. And what about the person whose neighborhood has now got dust and disruption and so on? So, and I especially would want to frame this. So if you would just think about how to take these national benefits and how a person whose life has been disrupted by local development, how is that person to take in that? And also your catalog of what the state of Colorado has done. If we brought a space alien to listen to that, the space alien might think, well, these are going to be happy people in Colorado. Look at all the things that have been done for them. And instead we have quite a remarkable movement for local control and discontent with state authority. So if you could speak about these local concerns in the context of the big national and international benefits of natural gas, and also why didn't your story bring us into a group hug?
My clients don't do group hugs.
Oh, I see now. You need different clients. Well, you don't need different clients. You need to loosen your clients up.
Jim can go first this time.
No, this is, I mean, it's a really interesting and an absolutely valid question. I remember, my context, I read the newspapers and read the reports of all the things that are going on here, but I really live in a different world at this point. And what this reminds me of immediately was a meeting in Copenhagen in 2009. You remember that was the last major climate conference in which it didn't come to much, but it was the last major gathering. And we had a very prominent workshop on fracking with Aubrey McClendon, who was then the head of Chesapeake. And he's a major operator and probably the most public operator in the natural gas world. And he was making a presentation about what the industry was doing. And I was sitting next to Maggie Fox. You all know Maggie was there, and we were sitting next to each other. I think we were the co-hosts of this event, or I wouldn't be surprised. And Maggie said, you have not developed a code of conduct and best practices related to all of the things that Jim has mentioned are happening in the state of Colorado. From disclosure to water recycling to measurements of ethanol emissions. There are a whole series of what do you do about siting. All of these issues, and Aubrey at that point really got his back up quite a lot. Well, think about all the benefits that this is bringing to the world and how there's all the jobs that it's bringing in. It's a lot cleaner than it was. I mean, all those very valid arguments. And after we had this, it got to be quite stormy about what are the responsibilities of the industry. A wonderful woman who is now the European Environment Commissioner was sitting right behind me, and she said, if you don't do all of those things, she said to Aubrey, if you don't do all of those things, you're going to lose your license to operate. I said, isn't that interesting? And that's what's going on here. It seems to me that, and I've met with Koga, Jim's been at some of those meetings, where I spoke to the car, oil, and gas industry and said, you have got to adopt a set of best practices. You have got to ally yourself with the regulatory authorities. You have got to become a friend of the renewables community. This is where your future is. And don't allow yourselves to get dug in to being part of the lords of yesteryear in a fossil fuel world that is an old fossil fuel world. There's a new one coming. And this is what the public's going to be for, and this is what the public's going to embrace, and this is going to be your license to operate. Because the public, if you don't do this, the public's going to get very angry. You can just, you know what's going to happen. No. Anyway, it seems to me what we're seeing now, and you know what's going on in Colorado, if, you know, there's becoming to be, despite the fact that the state's done so very, very well compared to everybody else, despite that, there is a public reaction setting in because of, well, Jim, you can speak to it, or you guys can speak to it better than I can. I just read about this and I say, I remember the Danish minister saying, you're going to lose your right, you're going to lose your license to operate, you know, if you don't follow and let the world know that you are following absolutely the best practices. So it's a cultural problem in part for the industry as well. Some operators in the industry are terrific. I mean, anybody, you'd sit down with any of them and have dinner with them and have a fantastic time talking to them about, you know, what they're doing and why they're doing it and where they want to go. And, you know, they're unfortunately not yet a majority of the industry by any means. All right, I'll stop with that.
Yeah. Jim?
So, I mentioned very briefly the rules that were recently adopted by the Air Quality Control Commission here in Colorado just over 2 weeks ago. Very stringent requirements for detecting leaks, fugitive leak emissions, and for repairing them. Equally stringent requirements for preventing venting from every kind of tank that you might, you might find in the oil and gas sector. The first requirement for controls of methane of any government in this country. Enhanced inspections and increased fines are a feature of the landscape that the companies are dealing with now. But perhaps most important, the proposal that the Commission was considering for 5 days, including Saturday and Sunday, was written in large part, propounded by the 3 energy companies that account for 85% of the production in this state, and by the Environmental Defense Fund, and by the largest midstream operator in the country and in the state. We got together, we developed a plan, we addressed methane, which is anywhere from 23 to 85 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases. The industry made very significant concessions, including the decision to acknowledge the need to regulate emissions of methane. They made very expensive commitments to do that leak detection and repair. It will result in, I believe, significantly fewer complaints from the public about oil and gas development that might be occurring anywhere in their neighborhood or in their community. And it was adopted by a vote of 8-1 Sunday evening 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks and a day ago. I believe that it is the way in which you can deal with oil and gas in this country if you're willing to acknowledge the need to develop oil and gas for some period between now and when we reach that goal of having substantially decarbonized society. And if you don't think it's good enough, then I think we want to hear what your suggestions are for improving the regulation of oil and gas in Colorado, up to the point where it becomes something more than you don't want it occurring in your backyard, at which point it's very much more difficult to have the conversation. But those companies, those 3 companies, Canna, Noble, and Anadarko, recognize that they have to earn that social license to operate. They are spending a great deal of money and a lot of time and people time, human time, in planning to meet those expectations. And we're at the frontier. We're doing the very best that we can think of to manage the environmental and social effects of development of oil and gas in the most responsible way that we can think of. Whether it's ever going to be good enough is a question. Is it ever good enough, or is this really a different debate hiding behind the call for regulation of oil and gas? We're calling that question.
I'll just.
Well, it's never going to be good enough. You know, we're never going to get from here to there, and that's the enemy and the good part of this. You know, you got to do aggressively, you know, a lot of this is muddling through. I mean, you do the very best that you can dealing with Detroit, and it was a major step in the right direction. Let's hope Colorado becomes a model for dealing with fracking for the rest of the country. Wouldn't that be terrific? Wouldn't it be great if the state of Colorado and its administrative practices were adopted by other states, and they strengthen their mechanism enough so that they can do the job that states are now required to do, regulating the industry or thinking about the, you know, how does the industry fit in? There are lots of wouldn't it be great items, and let's hope it all happens. I hope it happens. You know, I hope that this is the path. But in the meantime, you know, that, and I believe that natural gas is part of this. But in the meantime, you know, you got to keep asking the questions and keep pushing on them. We're not being Panglossian about this by any means. You know, natural gas emits a lot of carbon still. You know, what are we going to do about that? If we decarbonize and get rid of all coal-fired power, and we have the most efficient automobiles in the world, and we can get to both of those places, those paths are pretty clear. What are we going to do about all the power plants that are still burning natural gas, they're still emitting, putting a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, and how does that fit against the 80%? Well, we got to drive, seems to me, the natural gas industry to not only be good citizens in terms of the way they operate, but to be the best partners for the strategy for decarbonizing and moving to the world that we have to move in, the world of 450 parts per million and 2 degrees centigrade.
Well, we're reaching the time when we shift over to questions in a moment. I just have one question. I guess I'm still wondering about the citizen discontent thing. Mm-hmm. And so if we say to other states, you would assume the leaders in other states, if we say to them, oh, you must follow Colorado's wonderful example, the leaders in those states would want to then say, and did that produce a harmony and civic peace? And if you, well, I'm giving up on the hug thing. That's not happening. But I just think that's I mean, how do we say to other states?
We got a system that is highly decentralized, but you're beginning to see a lot of citizen disconnect bubbling up in Ohio and bubbling up in Pennsylvania, and New York has made it very clear that they're going to put very, very strict requirements on this, and there's going to be a lot of difference. You know, I had great hopes for what the federal government might do and the Department of Energy in terms of developing a sort of draft set of sort of the ideal operating system, and that the good guys in the industry would be strong enough to bring those into broad industry acceptance. John Deutsch, again, who was the former Secretary of Energy, professor at MIT, terrific guy, had done a very good job of drafting these. We even went as far at the UN Foundation. We spent a lot of time with the people at ExxonMobil, thinking that Exxon, as the largest natural gas operator in the country and a very good operator, when Exxon does something, they do it very well. This is not a fly-by-night operation. They do things very, very well. That Exxon would undertake this and make this sort of their industry. They would take the leadership within the industry and really drive this idea of the best possible standards. That has not yet happened. Maybe it's on its way. Jim, you might know more about this than I do. But I remain hopeful. And Canna and Adarko and people at Noble who are here, very good operators, are small compared to these other guys, and these other guys have got to step into it. How do we get them to do that? That's a big order.
Go for it.
Okay, so I'm starting here with some air and emissions questions because we have been speaking a lot about the recent regulations. If you include methane released in fracking as part of the impact of using natural gas, is this worse than the amount of greenhouse gases emitted by coal plants? Well, where do we put the methane, fugitive methane emissions?
Are we going to answer these, or are you going to read them all first?
No.
No?
No.
Answer them?
Yes, answer them.
Okay.
They're somewhat different, so.
So, University of Texas, just last year, I guess, relatively late last year, with the collaboration of a number of energy companies as well as EDF and I think some other conservation groups, but I'm not sure about that. Oops, I'm sorry. Sorry. Thank you, though. Did an investigation. They went to a number of well sites that were being developed, wells being drilled, and then doing the fracking, the hydraulic stimulation, and then measuring the amount of methane emitted into the atmosphere when they were using green completions. Or basically, a green completion, for those of you who don't live in this world, is you capture the stuff that comes out of that well between the time when you fracked it and when it becomes a producing well, where you're still going to be capturing the emissions. It's a relatively new technology, much newer than the technology of hydraulic stimulation. But what they found was that the amount of methane emitted if you're using this technology, which Colorado has been requiring now for 7 years, if my math is correct. But the emissions into the atmosphere using green completions or reduced emissions completions are very, very small compared to what you'd see if you weren't using those technologies, which have become commonplace in Colorado and elsewhere. Not everywhere, but in Colorado. So that if you use green completions and you're doing the kinds of inspections for fugitive emissions that the new law or the new regulations in Colorado require, if you're looking for methane as well as all of these other hydrocarbons, if you're doing all of those things, the natural gas that you'll be using to generate electricity, to heat homes or whatever, will have a clear and significant advantage over coal as a source of energy for whatever period of time we're talking about. That means that it's important to expand what the EPA regulations from not just natural gas wells to oil wells as well. There are more things that we can do to capture methane between the point where it's produced from an oil and gas well and it reaches your stove or your furnace or whatever. A lot of work to be done in the distribution system in cities like Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania or Philadelphia and elsewhere. Tremendous amounts of work to be done there, but it has the advantage of being feasible. We know where that stuff is, we know how to capture it, we know how to see it or find it. It's an achievable but not inexpensive task.
And it's got value. It's got value. Captured it.
I'm sorry?
It's got value.
It has value. It doesn't pay for itself, but it has value.
Here's, if you were always free to say, I'm really not in this world and cannot tell you about bioalgae, for instance. With regard to controlling methane emissions, do you think bioalgae is a workable solution?
Not a clue.
Me either. We got that in common here. So, okay, and then
I defer to Martin.
we're going with
I
him.
always have, yeah.
None of us have a clue. Regarding this, I think this is got an edge to it here a little bit. Regarding the strongest emissions regulations recently passed, I hear they are completely irrelevant due to the impossibility of enforcement. The glasses are key to suggesting. Okay.
You know, Jim can speak to this, but one of the issues that does exist is who are the regulators and how capable are they? You know, I think Colorado's got a pretty good capacity. Some states have absolutely no capacity whatsoever, and the industry is very happy to keep it that way. You know, they can do what they want, and you know, that's a real problem, and that goes back to sort of a basic set of standards. And you know, should there be a set of federal standards? Should there be a set of federal guidelines? We currently don't have such a thing. You know, I believe that there ought to be. It doesn't have to be that it's regulated by the federal government, but there ought to be a best practice set of standards, which also is a best practice kind of management standards, which are pretty well understood as to what do you need, given the volumes of what you're dealing with, the number of wells, and that sort of thing.
We're going to a little...
I'm going to take a shot at that question, though, because I think it is entirely untrue that there are states where there are no resources dedicated to inspection and enforcement. There are certainly states that need greater resources and more inspectors. That is unquestionably true. Colorado has significantly increased the number of inspectors on the job, and part of my job is trying to defend, actually not defend, but settle inspection violations that are detected by either OGCC inspectors or CDPHE inspectors. And I can tell you that Those violations come with significant costs. $15,000 a day is not uncommon for each violation. There are a lot of inspectors that are hitting thousands and thousands of wells every year. Could we use more? Almost certainly, but it would be unfair and untrue to suggest that the absence of additional inspectors somehow vitiates very stringent regulations, because the companies that are out there on the front of this, Encana, Noble, Anadarko, DCP, have a significant reputational investment in ensuring compliance or going beyond compliance with environmental laws and regulations. The very last thing they want is a newspaper story, a television story, or whatever, suggesting that in fact they've fallen short of the game. They pioneered this technology. They've been using it voluntarily for years here in Wyoming. I'm convinced that we're going to see significant reductions in emissions of both those conventional pollutants and methane across the state.
Sorry, could you repeat the estimate number?
15,000, up to 15,000.
How does that compare with GDP?
With the GDP, well, not much of anything compares to the GDP.
Okay, but now we're shifting to water. Can we afford the quantity of water that fracking requires? How can operators, or can they promise that the water put back is, can the operators promise, and can they deliver on that promise, that the water they put back is usable by the population? So can we afford the quantity, and how can we treat it for future use?
Well, there's several questions there. I'm going to try and answer them, and I'm going to try and look at my cheat sheet because I can't remember all of this stuff. But there's a lot of detail out there. I think I didn't even write down this calculation. But we use, I think, 23 more times. No, way more than that. We use several trillion gallons of water. 3, I believe. 3 trillion gallons of water every year to water our lawns and to water golf courses. The amount of water used in hydraulic stimulation pales when you think about 3 trillion gallons used to keep our lawns green. It's a stunning comparison. Having said that, companies understand that many of them operate in parts of the country, the Permian Basin in Texas, parts of Colorado, and elsewhere where water is a precious commodity, and that they need to do more in reusing and reusing the water they're used throughout the process. I think Anadarko here in the Denver-Julesburg Basin up in northeastern Colorado is right now recycling roughly 90% of the water it uses in hydraulic stimulation. Other companies are working at trying to find ways to recycle water as well. And Canada does that at its operations over in the Piceance Basin. It's a complicated process. It requires a lot of infrastructure investment. It doesn't come free or even cheap, but the companies are making those investments in response to public's concerns about water used in the industry, recognizing that we use lots more water in other parts of our society.
Does anyone know what's in that oh so mysterious fracking fluid? Is it destined to remain secret, like the formula for Coca-Cola, which has profits and silicon and what else in it? So, okay, there we go. Destined to remain secret.
No, I don't think so. The Secretary's Energy Advisory Board, I think it's the John Deutsch Group, I'm losing track of days, but within the last several days released a report calling for greater inquiry into claims of confidentiality for the materials that are used in fracking wells other than the water and the sand and so on, the chemicals. I think inevitably we're moving toward greater public disclosure rather than less. It's not going to happen overnight, but I think we're moving in that direction, and one of the consequences, I think, of greater transparency will be the development of frac fluids that contain less unpleasant materials.
Early on, when we were meeting with Aubrey McClendon was the lead guy for the industry and was very visible and in very many places. Told us at a session in Aspen that he thought this could all be done with water, that they were going to get to the point where you could do everything with water. which I repeated back a number of times to people, is that going to be possible? I mean, I don't think it's tenable to maintain sort of the secret, particularly when you're dealing with public water and public lands and so on, to not disclose. And it's going to happen. I think Jim's absolutely correct. It's going to happen, not right away, but we're so much further now than we were 5 years ago. I mean, a long, long way down the road, and that disclosure will happen. Plus, they'll get a lot more sophisticated about what they don't have to use in the process, and I understand that that's happening maybe even more rapidly than disclosure.
Well, this last question on water, what alternatives are there to hydraulic fracturing to complete an oil and gas well? I'm not sure if that refers to the explosives or other kinds of things.
I'm not quite sure how to answer that question, except to say that well over 90% of the oil and gas wells completed in this country use hydraulic stimulation or fracking. There's intense, well over 90%. There's intense research going on to find different ways of doing the hydraulic fracturing, whether it's with propane, I think, and with different chemicals and so on, some non-toxic chemicals and so on. Intense research. I'm convinced the industry will eventually get there, probably sooner rather than later. But at the moment, no, I don't know of any alternatives.
Again, one of the wonders to keep in mind of the situation in which the United States finds itself today. 5 years ago, we were very dependent upon imported oil. Today, I think we produce more oil than we ever have in our nation's history. And a large part of that, this has nothing to do with fracking for natural gas. It is fracking of old oil wells. And that is, as I understand it, sort of the average recovery from a quite traditional, and there was great differences, but it was like 35% of the oil in that particular formation would be recovered. With fracking, that has increased very dramatically into the 70s and 80%, and where most of the activity, I think, going on in the United States today, outside of North Dakota, where most of the activity is going back into existing fields and wells that have been shut down and reopening those wells, and that is creating, with this new technology, a real bonanza, and that's paying off for the country in terms of our now a much, much stronger position related to oil dependence or independence.
I'm shifting now to some questions about sort of consumers and citizens. How can we keep the right and left engaged in a rational and science-based conversation on problems, goals, and solutions if many in Boulder want a fracking ban, even though natural gas can help with climate change?
Well, it's a problem with politics too. I mean, you know,
that's a topic.
What are you going to do? And maybe the next session you ought to ask Ted Cruz to come up.
That is not on our agenda.
Not on your agenda?
So we're an open-minded group.
I'll volunteer Martin to be.
No, God. There's limits. There are limits.
If you're in politics, you got to know you're never going to get 100% of people agreeing with what you're just never going to happen. If everybody in this room, if everybody in this room had to sit down and try to agree, get a majority of people to agree on what movie to go to tonight, you'd be here till about 11 o'clock tonight because of the differences in what I've seen now, and I want to go to a documentary and don't like so-and-so and too much skin here or whatever it may be. We'd never get to agreement. I mean, and that is the trick of politics, as Jim's saying, try to find, a way in which you can move the issue, if in fact you're interested in moving the issue. A lot of people aren't interested. They don't want to do anything. What I find most discouraging about the current Congress is that a lot of individuals seem to be there for the purposes of putting in their time and staying there rather than actually accomplishing something. But if you are, in the business of trying to get something done and find a 50% plus one of the votes and to try to move that, you're going to run into all kinds of flack. It's going to happen. But you got to explain that to people. You got to explain them what you're doing, explain them why you're doing it, have many sessions as possible. And remember, if you're in public office, that nobody ever expected, you should never have expected that people were going to say thank you. They're not going to say thank you. They're going to come to the next town meeting and beat the bejesus out of you, not about methane, but about, I don't know, something else, right? It's okay. They'll all be there. It's all right. That's the process.
Oh.
And it's got, you got to have a sense of humor about it. It's what?
Humor. Speak about humor.
We got to have a sense of humor about it. It's funny.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, it really is funny. And then you can talk. Bev Sears ran our office up here for a long time. And they go to Beverly after a town meeting and say, "Old Wingnut was here, and hear what he had to say tonight." It takes there's a whole variety of things. You takes all kinds. You hear all kinds of views of this, and
Well, I'm tempted to shift to a kind of life lessons and a human relations workshop, but actually I'm still sort of in there with these.
But it's part of this. It's part of this.
Oh, sure.
It's definitely part of this. You have to try to figure out what's the consensus like Jim is doing. These 5-day meetings to come up with a set of rules. Who do you get on board and how much work does it? It takes a huge amount of work. And it's very frustrating. It takes a lot of time and a lot of patience, and you have to listen carefully. That's the stuff of public policy. It's hard. It's not something that gets made overnight, and people assume that this is something that, you just make a decision and happen. It doesn't, on a decision that's meaningful in any way, it's not easy. Right? And that's why what these people have done, what Jim has done in the state of Colorado, is so remarkable. Particularly when you listen to what's happening in a whole lot of other states where they're not even close.
Yes, and by all means you should be in on.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that when Tim was in the Congress, the Science Committee was the Science Committee. Today, the Science Committee is an oxymoron. They don't do science anymore. Expecting that the federal government is going to come to our rescue, I think, might be expecting a lot. And I think that the secret to what I've seen in Colorado and Wyoming and elsewhere is that there is a discussion, there's a dialogue to be had with state governments, with state agencies, and with responsible companies, and there are more of them than you might think, to try and find ways to move that ball forward. It might not be the home run every time, but if you can get to first or second base, there's a chance of getting to home base sooner or later.
Okay, on consumers and their conduct. Most or all of the regulations mentioned tonight have focused on industry activity. Do either of the speakers suggest, or would either of the speakers suggest regulations or taxes on energy consumers to advance their goals?
Of course, the best thing that we can do is to price carbon. I mean, that's the single most important step that ought to be taken. We're a long way from there, but in my view, that's what we ought to do, is put a price on carbon. Everything else we treat emitting carbon is a free good. We act as if the atmosphere is, as I said earlier, a free garbage dump. And we pay for other things. You pay for what you get. And in this situation, we're getting a whole lot more, and we're not paying for it. It would make a great deal of difference. And you can run a program. This has been modeled out in lots and lots of different ways by various tax authorities. It has to be done, I think, largely on a national basis, and we would hope eventually on a global basis. We don't know how to do it yet, but you can do it so that the money gets rebated directly back to individuals. I think the minute you try to have a carbon tax and then use the money for doing anything else, you're going to run into a real buzzsaw, and that's what happened with the last climate legislation on Capitol Hill, is that there was an attempt to put in place a cap and trade program, which was effectively a kind of a tax, but then to take the revenues from that and use it for renewables and use it for international activities and use it for other things. And the minute that happened, I went up with my friend Boyden Gray to see Lamar Alexander. And Lamar said to us, this was in the early days, he said, don't worry about talking about Waxman Markey, it's not going to happen. He said, it's not a cap and trade program, it's cap and tax, and we're going to call it a cap and tax program. Lamar was the number 2 or 3 guy in the Senate and the Republican side at the time. He said, we're going to call it a cap and tax because that's what it is. And that's what it was. And the minute it became a cap and tax program, it was history. So we've got to figure out how to do this pricing in such a way that it's 100% rebated back to the citizenry, so there's no sense that this is so that it doesn't carry all that other baggage, put it that way. It'd be hard enough to do as it is.
This one I
agree.
think is, oh, sorry. Yes,
See, there's consensus.
There's, right, I want to challenge that a bit. And, okay, so this one I think is for you, and it has to be read with a little bit of intensity here. I'm tired of hearing that we consumers are the problem for driving cars. What choice do we have? The oil and gas industry has systematically killed alternative modes of transportation, trolleys, trains, electrical cars, over decades, despite the popularity of those vehicles. This is a systems problem and needs a system solution. Riding my bike to work isn't going to do it.
Yeah, Jim.
Yeah.
Well, there is this notion abroad about the land that these companies get together, they conspire, they collude. I have to tell you that after having worked for this industry, even for just 7 months, the notion that any two companies can get together and agree on anything, including lunch, is a chimera. These guys don't collude, they don't conspire, they don't even work together. They don't agree. They each have their own corporate culture, they each have their own corporate goals, their strategic plan, and they do not depart from it, they do not diverge from it, which is sometimes a challenge. But the notion that these companies are getting together to affect your transportation choices, in my opinion, I wish I could get these companies to work together more often, and it is a Herculean task. They're not conspiring against you and your bicycle.
But isn't it interesting to think about transportation and how much better it's getting? You know, the numbers of people, if you see the data on the numbers of people who want to use mass transit are increasing very significantly. The number of people driving in the country has leveled off, and the efficiency of automobiles is now, the efficiency of engines is now scheduled to double over the next 25 years. I mean, this is a massive change. If anybody would have said 20 years ago, Jim, that Detroit was going to be in a situation to dramatically increase the efficiency of engines, we would have said, there's no way in the world that's going to happen. Well, a recession came along, deals got cut, whatever it was, and we're now headed into that direction, and it's a great thing. It's not perfect by any means, but it's a huge step in the right direction.
It is, and just, again, days are melding into each other. It wasn't today, so it must have been last week. The EPA has been working internally for years now, trying to figure out whether or not, so their dilemma was you can get these cleaner cars, dramatically cleaner cars, but you can't get them with the amount of sulfur that's in the gasoline you buy at the gasoline station today. So that means you either have to give up on more efficient cars or you have to require refiners, which is a part of the industry I don't represent, but you have to figure out whether or not you can require them to, again, substantially reduce over and above what they've done, I think twice now, the amount of sulfur in gasoline to enable those cleaner vehicles, cleaner burning vehicles. And despite what you might hear about the oil and gas industry, they lost. They lost. The refiners are now going to be required to reduce the sulfur content of gasoline dramatically, all over and above what they've already done. And it's going to be very expensive. It will probably raise the price of gasoline as much as a cent a gallon. But there's always trade-offs. But Detroit won, and that's symbolic, I think, of where we're headed as a country.
Okay, we're moving to a few big energy.
Which is, by the way, if you look at the politics of transportation, the oil industry has won almost every time for 75 years. It's the auto industry, the industry itself, that has put on catalytic converters, that has changed and done. And they have now kind of come up to, this is a very, very interesting development because it's a swing in the kind of power, you know, and that the automobile industry had enough power to turn, in past years, this would not have happened.
That's true.
Okay, big picture energy questions. This one you covered part, but you might want the second one. When will there be a price on carbon and elimination of carbon subsidies? So we didn't really quite get the subsidy thing in yet.
Well, I think the subsidy issue will probably end up taking care of itself politically, more likely than getting a price on carbon. We don't know how to do a price on carbon yet in a way that's going to be acceptable, but I think we're creeping in that direction. I think there are lots of industry, lots of powerful industry groups that would like to see a price on carbon because they see what's going on in terms of long-term climate policy. what has to be done. I mean, these are not dumb people. You know, they're also seeing what's happening to the world, and that we are going to have to decarbonize, and that one of the best ways of doing that is to put a price on it. So I think that tends to be happening. You know, we'll not do it given the current Congress and the way the Congress is operating, obviously, but it's you know, it's not as far away, I think, as you might think in this world. I think it's more likely. It could well happen in the next 5 years in the United States that we have a good, healthy price on carbon.
Here's a question that I would have faked and put in here and pretended someone had written because it so takes advantage of your presence here. How do you think the tension in Russia and Ukraine will affect natural gas extraction policy in the U.S.? Are we going to export liquid natural gas to Europe like crazy, and will that be a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, I think everybody doing this kind of pounding of the table and so on related to Ukraine and Crimea is very misguided. You know, how would we feel if, you know, looking at our own backyard, you know, Crimea has been part of Russia forever. You know, it was just turned over to Ukraine, by Khrushchev 30 or 35 years ago. And, you know, this is their sphere of influence. My view is that, you know, what are we doing in the United States and Europe by pushing back, sort of pushing NATO right into Putin's face, right into the Russians' face, sort of asking for confrontation. I'm currently reading the book The Brothers about Alan Dulles and John Foster Dulles. It's absolutely fascinating. You know, picture of, my view, arrogant Uncle Sam in this day and age. And, you know, probably people aren't saying that, but I certainly believe it. And that we've got to be very, very careful, you know, what we do and how we're doing it, what we're getting ourselves into, and what business we have to be pushing in this area. The idea of somehow exporting a lot of natural gas, which is going to be zero impact given the volume of gas that comes out of Russia, that's not going to have an impact. Maybe it'll give some senators something to talk about in speeches on the Senate floor, but I can't imagine it'll have much more impact than that.
Could you speak more, Tim, about, this is for you, speak more about stranded assets? They seem to be much more valuable uses, there seem to be much more valuable uses for carbon than burning fuel, petrochemicals, all some of our correspondence, the recreational wear that you were speaking, the Patagonia products. So there are many things to be done besides burning it. Is it that the amount of time that it takes to sell these products as fuel is so much quicker?
In the volume, it's easy to use. I mean, in transportation, you know, there's never been a substitute so far for liquid fuels, and you know, we're moving to more efficient automobiles, and that's gonna happen over a period of time. And you know, but the oil in the ground cannot all be burned. It just can't happen. This is where Keystone Pipeline comes in. You know, Keystone Pipeline is all about, you know, what are we going to do? Are we going to add to this enormous reserve of carbon and say we're going to put it up into the atmosphere as well? Well, where are we going to start to draw some lines? When are we going to have some kind of sense about what we're trying to do on a long-term basis? Energy policy isn't a long-term basis. It's muddling through. So the president's got Keystone sitting on his desk, and you know, maybe the good citizens of the state of Nebraska will give him a little more lead time, so he doesn't have to make a decision until after the November election, which I think may happen. I mean, it is how much carbon, we got a lot of carbon. What are we going to do? Are we going to burn it all? We're not going to burn it all unless we want to commit suicide. So how do we stop doing this? How do we decarbonize? That was one of the first words that Jim used, absolutely accurately. So you take them one step at a time, one piece at a time, and trying to figure out how to deal with this resource problem is one of the ones that we have to do. You know, why are the energy, you know, one of the reasons they're so uptight about all of this is that they see this down the line, and they can't figure out yet how, you know, their company and the valuation of their company is going to get managed as we decarbonize. And it's a very legitimate question, and that's one that we ought to be seriously thinking about. You know, our economics profession, if there is such a thing, ought to, you know, that the work that has to be done there is really significant and very interesting.
the two people who wrote Keystone Pipeline questions, you were mind reading now, and you anticipated the question that I was about to ask. So I think those, you just covered that one. With all the good efforts, and this is back to both of you, with all the good efforts to reduce carbon emission, what is the likelihood that restriction below the 2 degrees centigrade tipping point can be successful?
You got to keep trying, man. What's the likelihood? I mean, you know, I'm not going to be pessimistic and say here we don't have a chance. It's really hard. I mean, 80% reduction in the amount of fossil fuels, the amount of carbon we're putting in the atmosphere by 2050 is an enormous task. But you got to take them one at a time, and you got to keep working at it, and you got to keep talking about it, and you got to maintain a cheerfulness about it, and you got to look at your grandchildren and say, we got to do this. And you got to keep going after it.
No, I think Tim eloquently summarized it.
Okay, now we just, probably, I'm the only one who knows how many more of these we have, and so we have these two fine people, so we're going for probably another 10 or 15 minutes, and then I think I will be out of questions. And if you want to read my mind, as you just did with the Keystone ones, and anticipate.
I got a lot of questions for Jim, but I'll hold them until later.
Okay. So now we are on efficiency. You both made great points about energy efficiency and reducing our energy use. Why do you think the fracking debate has so far largely ignored efficiency? The focus has been on the supply side issues more than the demand side issues. How come?
Well, fracking's about production. Efficiency is really a different issue, and that by itself is, you know, extremely interesting. We are, I mean, on a global scale, trying to develop a set of agreed global standards, say on automobiles. You know, we've done this, and can we get broad agreement on automobiles across industries? U.S. has made real progress on power plants. Can we translate that and help others to come to a lot of that same technological change and shifts that have to be made? Can we, and one of the biggest issues, Jim can speak to this much better than I, what's the role of the State Public Utility Commission in Colorado and elsewhere? You know, they determine what the ratepayer is going to pay and what rate of return the investor gets, and how does that get changed by the state PUC so that the utility company is rewarded for doing efficiency as much as the utility is rewarded for producing new power. These are very interesting issues of public policy in which these obscure agencies, the public utility commissions around the country, are going to be very, very important to an aggressive increase of the agenda on efficiency. Jim, you've dealt with that much more in the state here, day in and day out.
I think, I mean, there's lots of good news out there, and it's important not to lose sight of the good news, but energy efficiency investments tend to happen in the background. You never hear about them, see them, but Governor Ritter in Colorado, Vermont, California, a number of states have made very significant investments through the Public Utilities Commission in energy efficiency, and that's one of the reasons that demand for electricity in the country is flat or declining slightly, which is something that we haven't seen since Edison walked the those were very, very important, and they had a real impact on demand for electricity as well. In Colorado, the Public Utility Commission requires investor-owned utilities. There's only 2 of them. It requires investor-owned utilities to make very significant investments every year in energy efficiency. They worked out a way for the utility to actually make money while doing that. Otherwise, they don't have much incentive to reduce demand for their product and to reduce their rate base. But they figured it out. There's several different ways you can do it. Colorado's using one. Vermont's using a very different one. But they're resulting in the same thing, which is flat or declining demand for electricity, which is one of the reasons you can think about renewables, for example, meeting all of the new demand for capacity, not necessarily replacing all of the generation capacity that would be retired, but meeting all new demand and more. So it's happening, it's quiet, it's in the background. Tim said it's really interesting, it's actually really boring, but it's important and it's being done.
Efficiency is the first fuel. You know, you'll hear that. It sort of has a nice ring to it.
Why are we in such a hurry to burn our country's natural gas? We may and probably will desperately need it someday. Should we declare a moratorium on drilling for natural gas to save the petroleum industry from itself?
I don't think so.
I don't know how the hell you do
How
that.
you do it.
And then flaring. A speaker here in this room last week said a third of the natural gas in North Dakota is burned because of overproduction. What is the situation, or because there's no place to transmit it or put it in a pipeline? What is the situation in Colorado, and is there some talk of requiring companies to reduce production so all natural gas is captured? I think we are speaking of oil production, in which gas is a byproduct. Otherwise, this is a frivolous greenhouse gas emission.
So Colorado and then North Dakota. In Colorado, there are 53,000 wells, I believe. Some of them, a lot of them are stripper wells, so not significant production, not significant emissions. But there's a total of 60 or so wells that are currently flaring rather than capturing the gas and putting it in gathering systems. So
60 out of 53,000.
yes, it is not a significant problem in Colorado yet. Some concern about making sure that we don't replicate in Colorado the North Dakota experience. But the governor is committed to tackling this issue and creating some regulatory requirements for tying in your gas production, even if it's associated gas at an oil well. And I think we'll probably get there in relatively short order. North Dakota, it's not necessarily overproduction, it's just that there's a lot of gas associated with some very rich oil plays. And the state is really, if you haven't been to North Dakota, it's really an educational experience to visit western North Dakota where the oil production is occurring. It's a tremendously rural part of the state, and the task of getting gathering systems to those wells is gargantuan, but the state is really trying hard to try and find ways to make sure that the gas that's produced along with the oil, which is what they're looking for, gets captured. The problem is that until very recently, as in 3 or 4 weeks ago, value of the gas didn't really warrant the construction of those gathering systems. It just didn't make any economic sense. So they're looking for other incentives, other ways of incentivizing the companies to put in those gathering systems and to capture that gas, because it really, the people in North Dakota seem to have agreed with you that it is, it amounts to waste of a resource.
Okay, so these are a little bit scattered as the last few here, but do either of you know anything about Tarrant County to the degree where you could compare it to build? Well, okay, that's okay, that's what I thought.
Never, don't even know where it is.
Yes, like Pennsylvania, I would assume Pennsylvania. Okay, I don't really know. Boy, when we have belly flops up here, we really,
What?
all three, when the three of us don't know something, we really don't know it, so we can't do that.
Maybe there are a lot of others we haven't admitted.
Right, that's possible too. Okay, I want to pair these two because they're sort of an interesting, they are not similar in spirit, but I think it would be interesting if you had to take them on both at once. Could you give us an overview of natural gas? What work remains to make natural gas the clean energy bridge to the future? What work remains? But then somehow or other, put in your mind at the same time, is it true that the environmental destruction and the acquiring of natural gas negates the environmental advantages of using it?
I think we've really answered both of those.
You think you have to do it? Okay. Okay, so putting them together dynamically didn't get anywhere.
No.
Okay. Well, all right, I
Good
think you have
try,
covered that. Thank you. The new rules for protecting the air quality from fracking emissions are great, but what do we need to do next? Same sort of question as before. What additional steps can we take to reduce the environmental impacts of fracking? So what happens
Yeah,
next?
well, I was just going to, let me just mention a little bit about sort of surface impacts. I've been working with Ted Turner for the last 20 years, and he has a number of very large ranches and a lot of coal bed methane in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. He has a 100,000 acre ranch there with a very significant production of coal bed methane. It's not the same as what we're talking about here in terms of fracking for natural gas, but you have to have collection systems, you have water systems, and it's still a complicated business. You drive across his land, you would never know it's there because of the siting that's been done, because of the placement of piping system. If it has to be, which pipes have to be out at some point, they're all painted the same color as the landscape. You got to paint them anyway. They're all painted that way. It is amazing, and you drive through there and you have no idea that this is a huge field of coal bed methane, capturing a huge amount of coal bed methane, which I've always thought, you know, you drive to western Colorado and you go up, you know, and it's just one huge tangle of white sort of spaghetti across a lot of the landscape, and it's just so painful to see. So if I'm a citizen thinking about this, I get angry about that. You know, it's not necessary, but I get angry about it, and I think badly about the whole industry because of what they're doing to countryside. It may be theirs, or it may be leased to them, or whatever it is, but it doesn't appear, you know, I think that's one of the areas, a real flashpoint for people seeing this in terms of siting. We haven't talked about the issue of siting. It's, I think, relatively cheap to do, and we're learning a lot more about it, but a lot of opportunity there.
You and our correspondents had quite a lively paragraph about our failure in our discussions to really reckon with the landscape impacts of renewable energy. That when we are speaking of landscape impacts, we're often so focused on what natural gas production or oil production has done, and you wrote quite a peppy paragraph about,
Wow.
well, or just a pointed and lively paragraph. For instance, with alternative energy generation, renewables, and particularly wind, to put that in simple terms, you mentioned the scale of the transmission lines crisscrossing the West of recently untrammeled vistas to get that energy from renewables, clean, positive, huggable renewables, what that does to landscape. So how should we be pausing in our discussion of natural gas development to say there are comparable issues of landscape disruption to talk about for the renewable future?
I'm not sure it would be fair to say that they're comparable, but
Okay.
in getting to our goal of an 80% reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050, I think that we have to understand that there will be trade-offs across the board. I visited my parents in Illinois, and they live near a wind farm, and they have many of the attitudes about that wind farm that people in Colorado have about a natural gas well on the horizon. Very different situation, but it's quite common if you drive around Illinois, Iowa, places where there's lots of wind development to find, that you get much the same reaction as you do from folks here in Colorado who are unhappy about natural gas, oil and gas development. If you read the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal last week, the good news is that a company called BrightSource was opening its 400 megawatt solar thermal power plant. Good news. It's impressive, 400 megawatts, that's a central station power plant, that's great. But to get there, they leveled 5 square miles of desert. Nothing but insects will live there in our lifetimes and probably our children's lifetime. It is a sacrifice area. And I have companies that wish they got those kinds of rules from the federal government. 5 square miles, 400 megawatts, and we're talking about 130 gigawatts that we have to replace between now and 2040. There will be very significant surface use decisions that we have to make, and they will be difficult. We're going to have to make them. They'll be difficult. To get that goal of a 80% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050 here in the West, we have to build, by one account, 18,000 miles of new high voltage transmission lines that will cross those horizons that many of us in the West love and cherish. Again, more trade-offs that we have to think about. If the way in which we generate electricity today holds true 10 and 20 and 30 years ago. But I think the good news is that storage is on the horizon. Tesla's building a manufacturing plant with 6,000 employees. They seem to think that they found some way to store electricity, to provide electricity when the sun's not shining and the wind isn't blowing. Many of the technologies that Detroit and other auto manufacturers are using were not even imagined 20 years ago. So it may well be that we'll find ways in which to meet our energy demand that we can't conceive of today, and we have to hope so, because otherwise it's going to be great for lawyers, but nobody else.
Okay, this is a question that came in, this is the penultimate question. Why is it, this would have been in the water category, it came in a little bit late, why is it so hard to get rid of fracking's exemption from the Clean Water Act? And then one last question after that, and we're at the end.
Yeah, it was brutal. The Clean Water Act was, the Energy Act was 2007, it was Cheney's Energy Act.
Thought it was 5, but I don't remember.
2005, but anyway, it was in that period of time in which the Congress passed legislation and the President signed it that took away jurisdiction over from the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act for...
Actually, it isn't the Clean Water Act, it's the Safe Drinking Water.
Safe Drinking Water Act for... So and that's now in the law, and it's not going to get replaced, even though it's safe drinking water, which is motherhood and apple pie. You know, that's not going to, it's not going to change. So we're going to be stuck with, you know, where we are now, and dependent upon state regulation and all of this. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, and the need for state regulation. One of the things we have not talked about tonight, and I would just make a note on this, is the international negotiations on climate, in which there is going to be another major climate negotiation in Paris at the end of 2015. And the hope is that some very significant progress is going to be made there. There are some who believe that there's some way we can have a formula which is going to engage all of the countries of the world. I don't think that's possible at all. But we'll have a lot of mini agreements. I don't say many, there'll be significant. A lot of agreements running from forests. We're close to getting an international agreement on how to treat forests and how to value forests. There's a lot of activity on agreements on methane and methane emissions. Lots of discussions about what can be done on other efficiency measures. The Italians are leading a lot of the discussion about getting international emissions on standards on automobile efficiency. There are a series of pieces that are stacking up that are very promising. If we add all of those, we could see progress till about 2025 or so. At which point, then we're going to need a whole set of new technologies, as Jim was suggesting, you know, thinking about solar and wind and storage and the efficiency of generation and so on. We'll need a whole new series of technological breakthroughs by 2025 to take us to that next jump between 2025 and 2050. And, you know, maybe we will be able to get there. That's the hope anyway. Final note on that, which is really interesting, is the relationship between the US and China. The Secretary General of the United Nations in September is having a major climate summit, heads of state coming together in New York, and the Chinese are coming armed with a whole variety of initiatives. They are very worried about what's going on. You've read about this. Very worried about the environmental impact on the citizenry of China, but also very, very hopeful that they are going to assume a major, become a major industrial developer of various energy technologies, which they are currently doing. So they're coming to New York, we know, with a lot of significant investments and announcements. So we've gone to John Podesta, who is now in the White House, knows a lot about China, has led a China working group, which he asked me to be part of over the last few years, to see if it might be possible for the US and China to get together. This is kind of a dream. But could the US and China get together and together make a series of announcements about what we wanted to do related to fracking, what we wanted to do related to efficiency, what can be done in terms of coal-fired power, what can be done in terms of various administrative issues. There's sort of, you think about a ladder of two sides of the ladders, and the rungs would be all of these mutual concerns that the US and China, we each have these questions, and can we somehow loop those together in a way that the world would really sit up and take notice of the US and China. If you know, Xi and Obama coming together and saying, these are the things that we think are important as by far the two biggest, most important, biggest emitters in the world. Wouldn't that be great? So the White House has bought onto this, and we're currently, you know, trying to work this agenda and to see if that's possible. But it's, again, the sort of thing that if it were to happen, if we could get that to happen, That's psychologically a real breakthrough too, that people think, yes, it is possible. We don't have to be so gloomy about this. You know, there are things that can be done, and they can be done in a global way, and that would get you out of bed in the morning thinking about that.
So the very last question here, I think there is this state regulation that you cannot have a public program on fracking without disagreement. I think that was passed, which administration, can't remember. But we have this, what's going on with the two of you here? You've agreed on everything. Do you have something you disagree on? And if there isn't anything you disagree on, what's the miracle here of your having such different perspectives and recent years of experience? Why are you agreeing so much?
Jim ought to be the only problem is that Jim ought to be the next head of EPA. How's that, Jim?
Does he agree with that?
Something you don't want to do, but EPA is so terribly important and needs exactly this kind of incredibly thoughtful, we've been lucky in the last few years to have had good people at EPA. But let's hope that Jim Martin hangs in there in every way, because he's so valuable for what goes on here in Colorado and across the West. Patty, thank you for bringing us all the way.